information because there's so much in this book. It's just so much fun. And you covered so many different areas of the state. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Earl Brechlin, who has a wide and varied background, 40 years as a journalist, and a Maine guide. So you've traveled all over the state doing all kinds of cool outdoor things, and then all the research for the book as well. So you're an author, a journalist, a Maine guide, an outdoorsman, and an expert on ancient aliens. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll let you take it over.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you for having me tonight, and thank you folks for joining in tonight to talk about a subject near and dear to my heart, and that's just the wonderful state of Maine. And the whole idea for Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine is I traveled around the state as a guide and as a journalist. You'd hear stories or different legends or go by places that were just icons in Maine, the sign with all the countries up in, that say Paris, Rome, and all the rest. And I started to keep little snippets of that, and then decided as the bicentennial was approaching, talked to Dean Lunt, who's the publisher at Island Port Press, and said, hey, there's a great book here about all these great things, because you think about other states in New England, and I said, I can't imagine doing a book called Wild, Weird, Wonderful Connecticut. It just doesn't seem to have the same cachet. And so anyway, over the years, we collected about 600 possible items that could have gone in this book without really trying too hard. And so we have over 300 of them in the book. And tonight I'm going to share about two or three dozen of those with you and talk about some of those things. And people say, well, what's in the book? Well, it's sort of an encyclopedia as well as a compendium of all these wonderful things, because we have all the lists for the top 10 things in Maine, the tallest mountains, the longest rivers, the largest lakes. All the world records that were held by people in Maine are in this book. A list of all the lighthouses, all the covered bridges, and then the stuff o' Maine, the state dessert, the state bird, the state tree, those kind of things. And then there's a list that I refer to as the capitals of Maine. And Maine, I think a lot of the things in the book really came out of Maine people wanting a little something to boast about, or sort of differentiate themselves from other people in other places. And so for a while in Maine, particularly in the late 1800s, a town was doing great if it was the capital of something. I mean, Phillips, Maine was the toothpick capital of the world, and Franklin, Maine was the granite capital of the world, and Belfast was the broiler capital of the world. So there are all those kind of capitals. And for a while in Down East Maine, when I was working in the newspaper early years, we had a fellow who said he was the president of the world, of all the world's nations. And he was not to be outdone by a guy from Southwest Harbor who was the president of Oceanus, which was he declared all the world's oceans were their own country, and he issued his own currency. And there were a couple of prophets of God thrown in there too. So I always said Down East Maine was the capital of the world. But then, of course, there are towns that don't have any big claim to fame, so they became the Crossroads or the Gateway. But anyway, there's a list of all of those in the book, and can kind of talk about it. So the book is divided into 5 sections for different geographic areas of the state. And the whole point is I really want folks to get out and discover some of these areas and places for themselves. So, of course, anybody that loves Maine, loves to explore Maine, you've got to have a Atlas and Gazetteer in your car. If not, you've got one by the couch, you've got one in your office, you rotate them through. So at the end of every listing, there are the grid coordinates and the page number for the maps and the Atlas and Gazetteer, so you can go there yourself. So I don't give you step-by-step directions. Hopefully you got to be able to use the map, and you can get there and see what you're going to do. So as I mentioned, we had about 600 items in this, and also collected a lot of photos. There's about 140 different photographs in the book, but because I wanted several images for each item, I collected about 2,500 photos, and it's something you couldn't have done 20 years ago, before the internet, just because the wonderful things in digital commons, the Maine libraries and universities, the Maine Digital Commons has incredible photographic resources from all over the state, from historical resources to tourist icons of today. And it's a great way to kind of get those kind of things together. So anyway, I'm going to switch to share my screen here, and we'll get started, and we'll take a little trip around wild, weird, and wonderful Maine. And let's do this. Let's see. So we just have a few of those images that I mentioned before in this particular slide. But what I want to talk to first, and it seems appropriate because, I mean, Halloween is just around the corner here on Saturday. And people know about Stephen King's Pet Cemetery, but Maine has an actual pet cemetery on McArthur Island in Falmouth. And it was created by none other than Percival Baxter, the governor who served as governor Maine 1921 to 1925. And he really loved his pets. And he had all of his pets buried in this cemetery, which is along a walking trail now that's part of a park and open to the public. Now, Governor Baxter also had kind of another quirk in that he loved Irish setters. And over the years, he had 14 different Irish setters. But he really liked to call them all Gary. So if you look down the list of his Irish setters, there's a whole bunch of Garys on there, including Gary Owen, who was his constant, who was Gary too, was his constant companion at the State House and passed away while the governor was in office. Well, he created quite a stir because when he had the dog's body transported to McArthur Island from Augusta, he ordered that the flags over the state capitol be flown at half-mast in honor of his dearly departed dog. So the opposition party wasn't too excited about that. A lot of folks don't know that Maine was actually home to several prisoner of war camps during World War II, including a giant one over near Holton, and then what was called the Hobbstown camp near Spencer Lake up near Jackman, which housed over 300 Germans, and they worked in the woods cutting pulp, and they did ice cutting and what have you. Well, in March 7th of 1945, Maine experienced what I call the not so great escape. And a group of the Germans had fashioned homemade snowshoes, and they had made a compass using a peach can and magnetizing a needle, which according to one article that was written said it worked as well as one from L.L. Bean. And anyway, they took off into the woods and then launched the largest manhunt in Maine history with aircraft, 50 law enforcement people, FBI, state police, and they searched for 4 or 5 days and they could not find these guys. And of course, the March Woods, it's still cold, there's still a lot of snow. And so they finally went to a local guide and hermit and said, where are we going to find these guys? And he looked at the map and said, well, the river's going to be high here and there'll be some snow over there. So go right where these two streams come together 2 days from now and you'll find them. So 2 days later, the police went to that junction of those two streams, and there were those prisoners shivering cold and hungry, and they gladly gave themselves up. So it was done without any particular bloodshed. And the camp is gone now in Hobbstown. In 2006, school children in Jackman actually erected a monument there. And that's all that remains of it to this day. And you can see the picture of the monument there on the right-hand side of what remains. So this is one of my favorite stories of Maine, and kind of what inspired me to do the book. And there was the brig, the Lena Thorlow, who came to in Cutler, Maine, returned there in the summer of 1873. And the people in town noticed as she entered the bay, she was flying a flag to indicate there'd been a death on board. Well, once the boat was to the dock, they realized that the 27-year-old captain, Tristram Thurlow, that his 26-year-old bride, who had just married before they went on a voyage, had passed away. And they had gone to Cuba with a load of lumber, and she died of some type of a tropical disease. It's not recorded exactly what it was, but yellow fever was pretty rampant. But on her deathbed, she made her new husband promise that he would bring her back and bury her in Maine. So now you're in July of 1873, and how do you get a dead body back to Maine on a schooner that's going to take several weeks in warm weather and warm water to get back to Maine? So they figured it out, and they took a big giant rum barrel from the local distillery, and they put her in that, and then they filled it with rum to preserve the body, topped it off, put her in the hold, and sailed back for Maine. And then actually some of my research, I discovered that bringing bodies back from the Caribbean at that time, that was actually a pretty common practice. Well, when they arrived back, the captain, he was part of a wealthy family, he said, I want everything done up, I want a beautiful funeral, I want this taken care of. And the undertaker said, I'm not gonna open that barrel. I don't know what she died of, and I'm not gonna unleash that in this community. We can certainly all identify the current pandemic. So they did what any logical Mainers would do. They dug a large circular hole in the cemetery and buried her, barrel and all. And so she is still there to this day. This is her gravestone. And she was buried in a barrel of rum. Many folks don't realize that the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, actually visited Maine just before the outbreak of the Civil War. And he was a surveyor and part of the U.S. Coastal Survey. And they were working on Lead Mountain down in Eddington. And so someone told him that the air was good there for his ill health and that he and his wife would enjoy it. So in 1858, he and his wife, Faria, actually spent 3 weeks in a tent on top of Lead Mountain down East Maine. It's off the airline now, Route 9. And the man that was in charge of the surveying camp at the time and his subordinate was Alexander Dallas Bach, who was Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson. And legend has it that he left a trunk with mysterious orders in a local inn, and that's a picture of the house that was formerly the inn. And some had widely speculated it contained the secret plans for the Civil War and the outbreak of hostilities. But later on was proved it was just some surveying documents he needed taken back to Washington, D.C. And kind of keeping with the Halloween theme, a lot of folks don't realize that Margaret Hamilton, who started as the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, actually had a house in Maine, down off in the village of Cape Newog in Southport. And she purchased it in 1961. She was really well liked by local people and reportedly didn't scare children very much. One day, however, she fell into the ocean while rowing out to her island, and a local fisherman plucked her out and said, well, you can't possibly be the Wicked Witch because you hit the water and you didn't disappear in a cloud of smoke. Well, she passed away in 1985, and her family continues to enjoy that house today. Kind of sticking with the same theme of kind of horror films, one of the gentlest people I had the fortune to know was Gunnar Hansen, the man that you see on the right there. But he happened to be in the right place in the right time in 1974 in Austin, Texas, and he was cast as Leatherface, the huge fiend in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre cult film, which actually back then it was quite scary. And he was probably one of the most soft-spoken people you ever want to know, but if you saw him coming with that chainsaw and that mask, you'd certainly run the other way. He went on to have several roles in other movies, Demon Lover and Hollywood Chainsaw Hookers, all kind of campy films in their own light, and really earned a cult following. Meanwhile, back here, he was a freelance magazine writer and script writer and editor, did a local history for the town of Mount Desert, and eventually wrote the book Texas Chainsaw Confidential. And unfortunately, he passed away in 2015, but it's kind of nice to know that there's that little kind of horror cult connection here on Mount Desert Island. I think one of the unsung heroes of politics, and with the election next week, we're certainly on everyone's mind, was Frances Perkins from Newcastle, Maine. Now, she was hired as Secretary of Labor for Franklin Roosevelt and was the first female cabinet member to work, and she helped set up the Civilian Conservation Corps, Public Works Administration, and under her guidance, Social Security was established, a 40-hour work week was put in place, and things of that nature. So her only regret was that they didn't get to finish universal health care, and look where that's got us. We're still worrying about that today. Well, she spent many, many summers back at the family home in Newcastle, and in 2008, the property was purchased for the Frances Perkins Center, which preserves her legacy and her papers. And you can visit that today along the banks of the Damascotta River in Newcastle. Of course, Maine is not immune to UFO sightings and reports of strange unidentified objects. And probably one of the most famous one was in 1976 along the Allagash, where there were several reports that summer of flying saucers. And then twin brothers from Massachusetts reported that they were camping on the shores of Eagle Lake, saw lights, and then were later kidnapped by four-fingered aliens, which they called Greys, and were taken aboard their spaceship where tests were conducted. They reported it to a waterway ranger, but there was still some controversy for years, and that ran on to about 2016 when one of the men that was a party then recanted, claiming that they had done some recreational drugs and concocted the story and just decided to kind of go with it. But I think the craziest part of their story is throughout all the different recalling of the stories, they only claim to have had 2 beers each, which seemed a little low to me. I think too, one of the most remarkable families in Maine is the Stanleys. And the Stanley brothers were twin brothers, Francis Edgar and Freeland Oscar. They were born in 1849 in Kingfield and graduated the University of Maine, what's now the University of Maine of Farmington. And they went to teaching, but they had such inventive and industrious natures. And they, of course, started building steam cars, which we know now as the Stanley steamers. Those cars began setting records. They also invented the artist airbrush and dry plate photography. So one of their first steam cars was the first motor vehicle to ever climb Mount Washington, which took 2 hours to go about 7 miles to the summit. And in 1906, one of their Stanley steamers called the Rocket set a world speed record, and that's a picture of it up there on the right on a beach in Florida, and it went 127 miles an hour with steam power. F.E. Stanley invented the artist airbrush, which is the picture just to the right of the left side there, which is still in use today, and then dry plate photography. And up until that time, a lot of chemicals and mercury and things like that were needed. And it was such an innovation that a gentleman named George Eastman kept pursuing them for 3 years and kept offering more money, more money. Finally, he offered them $2.5 million, a princely sum, certainly back in those days. And George Eastman went on to found the Kodak company. So the 2 men from Maine really got the entire amateur photography scene going. Eventually, the Stanley brothers went out west, and in the picture you see in the bottom center is the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, which they built, and they brought guests to it in a 30 horsepower steam bus, which was called the Mountain Wagon. And that hotel went on to inspire Stephen King to write the book The Shining after he had stayed there one time, with its connection to Maine. And also the film Dumb and Dumber was filmed there. The Stanleys weren't the only ones that were geniuses in their family. Their sister, Chansonetta Amons, was one of the most talented photographers to ever work in Maine, and she's well known for her pictures of early working life and average people in Maine, and she traveled throughout rural America. So those 3 siblings had a huge impact on the state of Maine and on the nation. Maine has several towns that have disappeared over the years when dams have been built, and this is a picture of the Long Falls Dam on Flagstaff Lake, which was closed in 1950 by Central Maine Power, which was to help feed water down to the big dam Wyman Station in Moscow. And when they closed the gates and filled that lake, it inundated and completely drowned 3 communities: Flagstaff Village, Dead River, and the village of Bigelow. Most people sold out, some moved their houses, some were just left there and still remain under the water today. I think one of the most unusual things was there were 2 local cemeteries that had to be moved. So the power company paid to have 300 bodies exhumed and replaced in a brand new cemetery they created in the current village of Eustis. Unfortunately, one of the things that was lost here was in the village of Flagstaff, which had been named for the flag that was erected on a point along the Dead River, where reportedly were Benedict Arnold and his camp and his troops had stayed on their ill-fated march to Quebec, which was profiled in Kenneth Roberts' book, Arundel. The water is now 50 feet deep, and along with the towns and all these old buildings, there's also a couple of Air Force jets that crashed there over the years that are on the bottom as well. For those of you that may be a little longer in the tooth, you may remember a long-running Sunday television show called Gadabout Gaddis, and it featured Roscoe Vernon Gaddis, who was called the Flying Fisherman, and operating out of Bingham, Maine. He flew all over the country, and he would fly fish, and they had a photographer with him. And what was really interesting was that it wasn't all scripted like it is today. If he fished for a whole week and didn't catch a single fish, the program on Sunday showed him not catching a single fish, which nowadays no one would ever think of doing that kind of a thing. And he eventually founded an outdoor empire that included books and gear and posters. And eventually he purchased an airport, which is a grass field really, in Moscow or Bingham area there. And it's now home to the North Maine Rivers Rafting Company. And the Maine Aeronautics Association to this day continues to grant an annual award for the Gadabout Gaddis Cup, which is for major service to aviation in Maine. One of the things, if you're into geography in Maine, is we have a lot of backcountry, but what is the most remote spot in Maine? And what's interesting, that it's the old Bert and I guess you can't get there from here. Well, about 10 years ago, a pair of biologists from Florida calculated using maps and other GIS information what was the spot that was furthest from a road that you could get a vehicle on. Now in Maine, there's a lot of woods roads and things. So they spent a lot of time calculating this, and the winner was a spot in the forest about a mile from Russell Pond in the middle of Baxter State Park. Now in the picture at center, you're looking down Wassatecook Lake, and about a quarter of a mile past the end of that lake, up in that valley, is where that spot is. And I've hiked through there. The trail goes within probably 300 or 400 yards, but they won't release the GPS coordinates because they don't want people going to that spot. So they'll kind of tell you exactly where it is, and they worry that people might vandalize it or do that type of thing. What's really interesting, as remote as it is today, as the picture on the bottom right shows, this whole valley once teemed with giant sluices and with logging camps and with log drives and steam locomotives and engines because it had been logged over so intensively before 1900. So it's kind of interesting today that one of the most remote spots at one time was actually not so remote at all. Again, with the politics, of course, Teddy Roosevelt ran as for president under the Bull Moose Party, and one of the images created for that election effort is the one at right, which shows him riding on a bull moose swimming down a lake. Well, the wonderful thing about that is that this is one of the earliest examples of photoshopping, because the picture of him originally was on a horse, and someone had the picture of the moose in the lake, and they put the two together. And Roosevelt did spend a lot of time in Maine. He toured Moosehead Lake, he climbed Katahdin, he even stayed with friends in Bar Harbor at one point. And off to the left here, Roosevelt was actually kind of a sickly and kind of namby-pamby kind of guy. And that's a picture of him on the left with the scarf holding the rifle on his shoulder, with the two guides that kind of befriended him and really became lifelong companions. And that was Wilmot Dow and Bill Sewell. And they went on to manage his ranch out west and take him all over the place. And it's just kind of interesting that he really learned his outdoor skills and his love of the outdoors was here in Maine, even though he went on to found all the different national parks and things of that nature. One of the mysteries on Cadillac Mountain in Acadia National Park is this cross that shows there in the center. And for many years, people believed it had been chiseled there by crew members from the ship that Samuel de Champlain was on when he first came here in 1604 in September, and actually named Mount Desert Island. He said from the distance it looked like an island of desert mountains. So in French it was Ile de Mont Desert, and so that's how the place got its name. Well, for years, people would hike by this spot. The trail goes fairly close to it on the North Ridge, and everybody would marvel at it. But somebody then began to say, well, if he's sailing and exploring, and this is about a 4-mile hike from the nearest place you could beach a boat, why would his guys go up there and chisel this cross in the middle of the granite? It would take them weeks to do that. And come to find out, it was actually done by surveyors in 1908. And there's 3 more of them, and they mark the first parcel that actually on Cadillac that became part of Acadia National Park. So it's just kind of interesting how legends and things of that nature get started. Maine has a lot of places named for the devil and for hell and for all those kind of things. And here we see some pictures, Devil's Pulpit and York, and then the ovens in Bar Harbor, which actually started out as the Devil's Ovens, but then the people involved in tourism said, we're not getting a lot of visitors, they're afraid of the devil, so they just changed the name. The famous billboard near Kakajo that said, this is God's country, why set it on fire and make it look like hell. And there's Devil's Den, and there's even a place in Milo, which we talk about in the book, which has the devil's snowshoe tracks. Now, if the devil supposedly burns everything he touches, I don't know how you work snowshoes into it, but that's part of some of the legends in Maine. And one of my favorite is there's a place called Hell Before Breakfast Cove on Sislodopsis Lake, way in down East Maine in Washington County. And many official maps don't even show that cove, but supposedly there were some gentlemen, a man named Sam Hill, and they were moving rafts of hemlock bark down to the local tannery when one broke loose and started to drift away. And he jumped in and went to swim out to it. And he said, I'll fetch that or go to hell before breakfast. Well, he got about halfway out and he disappeared before the water. And after that, they named it Hell Before Breakfast Cove. And it's a place that you can go and visit to this day. On sort of a lighter note, very few people know that Maine is the birthplace of the donut hole. I think whether you like Dunkin' Donuts or whether if you're more interested in Timmy Horton, and supposedly 16-year-old Hanson Gregory, who was serving as a ship's steward in 1847, kept getting complaints, as all the crews and all the different cooks did, that his fried cakes were soggy in the middle and weren't cooked all the way through. And he came up with the idea of using a piece of tin to cut a hole so that it would cook evenly. And he went on to patent the idea. His mother and aunt started selling donut hole cutters. And he actually went to the 1940 World's Fair that had an exhibit and included a portrait of him. And to this day, he was from Rockport, Maine. On the 100th anniversary of his discovery, they placed a plaque along the old county road in Rockport, which is kind of runs between Thomaston and Rockland. And you can go and visit this plaque, which commemorates the man who invented the donut hole. I think one of the weirdest and quirkiest things, and this involves the library in Bangor. And long before the name of Hannibal was associated with some fava beans and a fine Chianti, folks in Maine automatically thought of Hannibal Hamlin, who was Abraham Lincoln's first vice president. He was a senator and ambassador to Maine. He was born in 1809 in Paris, Maine. And he died in 1891 in Bangor. And what happened was he was having dinner and playing cards at the Tarratine Club in Bangor on July 4th. And he collapsed and fell unconscious. And they tried to revive him, including, as one newspaper at the Count mentioned at the time, a dose of brandy and ammonia, which revived him momentarily. But his wife and son were soon at his side, and they laid him on this couch to make him comfortable, and he passed away. Well, for years, it sat at the Tarratine Club and eventually was donated to the Bangor Public Library, which actually has a sign on it now in its main library at the main desk, which asks people not to sit on the couch. And if you really think what happened to the last person that did, I don't think that's much of a problem. Maine, of course, is famous for gemstones such as tourmaline and topaz and things of that nature. But one discovery set a world's record, and it was in the quarry, the Bumpus Quarry in Albany Township, which is near Bethel. And it was the largest single crystal of beryl. It was discovered in 1928. It was 27 feet long and weighed 52,000 pounds. and it was tapered from 4 feet in diameter down to 9 inches in diameter. And pieces of it were shipped around the world, including to the American Museum of Natural History in New York and Harvard. But eventually, the last remaining piece, which is about 2 tons, was returned to Maine in 2017, and it's on display at the Maine Mineral and Gem Museum in Bethel, which is a great place to go. They have moon rocks there. They have all kinds of things of that nature. And what's interesting, the first discovery of tourmaline in Maine was made by a young man who was on a mountaintop near Paris, Maine. And at sunset, he turned and saw an overturned tree, and something was glinting in the roots of the tree, and he found these crystals. And that gentleman was Hannibal Hamlin's younger brother. So it's kind of neat that that family had more than one claim to fame. I call this Bangor's very Brady shootout. And in September of 1937, America's public enemy #1, Alfred Brady, and his gang showed up in Bangor, and they'd already committed 4 murders and 200 robberies and other crimes. And they went into Dakin's Sporting Goods and wanted to buy a couple of .45 caliber automatic handguns, which they did, and they paid with cash, and the clerk was a little suspicious. A few days later, a gang member came back and said, "Hey, we'd like to get some machine guns. Can you help us?" And the clerk said, he might know a rum runner or two that might be able to do that. Well, he called the FBI, and when the gang members returned a couple of days later, there was a dozen FBI agents and 15 Maine and Indiana state troopers waiting for them. They weren't going to go down easy, and they ended up having a big shootout right on Central Street in downtown Bangor with over 60 shots fired. And that little granite block on the right is now embedded in the sidewalk where that happened. And you can visit that today. Brady's body was never claimed by any family member and was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Bangor. And that's another spot that folks can kind of visit today. They always say you give someone the right spot, and with a big enough lever, they can move the earth. But measuring the earth has always been one of the bigger challenges. And in 1857, Congress directed the Coastal Survey to come up with accurate maps of the United States. So they decided to do that, they would need 10 super straight 5-mile baselines from Maine to Georgia from which to triangulate all of this in a site in Epic Plain, which is on the Blueberry Barrens, kind of north of Cherryfield, was decided. And they spent over a year and built what's called the Baseline Road. And they measured and remeasured until finally they had an accuracy of within 2 inches over 5.4 miles. And this was the project that was being overseen by Alexander Bach, who was a great-grandson of Benjamin Franklin, and Jefferson Davis. Now, they originally had 2 nice pointed granite monuments at each end of this, but over the years, people were vandalizing them, taking a few shots at them. So one exists now in the Maine State Museum in Augusta, the others in the Cherryfield Historical Society, but that Baseline Road is still there, and you can drive down there, and it really is impressive how flat and straight it is all the way across there. We go from monuments to surveying and measurement to one created actually in sort of a bit of self-aggrandizement, which is unusual since the individual who did it is called the Humble Farmer. And on his lawn of his home in St. George, down near Tennant's Harbor, he erected a 16-foot granite obelisk with a sheet steel monkey blowing a horn up on the top, and declared it to be the center of the universe. And of course, scientists can't tell you where the universe begins and ends. And so I guess anybody who wants to can declare that they are the center of the universe. Well, Bob Skoglund, who is the man who did that, he had a radio show on Maine Public Broadcasting for 28 years and was also on Maine Public Television. And he now operates a B&B. But if you want to go to the center of the universe and you don't believe it yourself or your yard, well, you can go down there and check out his particular obelisk. If you go far to as far as north, just about as you can go in Maine to Madawaska, there's a place called the Four Corners Park. And it was created because motorcyclists like to accept a challenge called the Four Corners Ride, where they go to Madawaska, Maine, Blaine, Washington, San Ysidro, California, and Key West to touch all 4 geographic points in the United States. So a local rider, Joe LaChance, and his wife, created this park so that when you get to Madawaska, you have an actual place you can kind of stop, and it has a granite monument and things like that. Well, they didn't want to be outdone by that. So they created the Four Corners Tour for Maine. And any motorcycle rider that wants to make 4 trips between Madawaska, Grafton Notch, Kittery, and Lubec can go in and claim that they have done that. And they'll give you a patch and a t-shirt that says you are now a member of the Titanium Butt Club for having ridden your motorcycle so far. A lot of folks don't realize that chewing gum really got its start in Maine, and it wasn't Tutti Frutti, and it certainly wasn't Bazooka bubble gum, but spruce gum, which was made from the saps scraped from the side of spruce trees, was popular in the mid-1860s, and John Bacon Curtis created the first large-scale chewing gum factory on 4th Street in Portland. That building is still there to this day. It's now the Hub Furniture. And he decided to add wax and sugar to the spruce gum, which is actually pretty obnoxious. I've tried it, and it's really not very pleasant, but made it a commercially viable product. And over the years, other flavors have been added, and of course, other companies have made it. But along with the donut hole, the United States, the world can thank Maine for chewing gum. Again, we talk about the spruce gum is an acquired taste. Well, for many people, Moxie is also. And it was invented in 1876 by Augustine Thompson of Lowell, Massachusetts, but he was a native of Union, Maine. And it was originally called Moxie Nerve Food. And although the formula was a closely guarded secret, it was believed to include a little bit of cocaine, like Coca-Cola was in its early years. And reportedly to this day, it includes gentian root. Moxie has had a legion of fans over the years: Calvin Coolidge, E.B. White, and even Ted Williams. And it was named the official soft drink of Maine in 2005. Since 1982, the town of Lisbon has had an annual Moxie Festival with parades and fireworks. And there was actually a house, the Moxie Bottle House, which you see an old postcard here on the left, was built to help promote it at a New England Moxie Congress. And it's actually back in Maine, and it's displayed indoors at the Matthews Museum of Maine Heritage in Union, which is on the Union Fairgrounds. Coca-Cola bought Moxie out in 2018, and you can still find it on the shelves. And on the right there, you can see there was a picture of a Moxie car that was part of the marketing efforts years ago. Not to be outdone by Moxie the soda, there's Moxie Falls in Maine, which is actually the highest waterfall in the state, which it's up near the Forks. The Moxie stream runs down into the Kennebec River, and it plunges, like I said, about 90 feet in its dark stained waters. So somebody said it was named that because it was inspired by people who liked Moxie, although Moxie supposedly is the Abenaki word for dark water. And they have a beautiful trail there with nice railings, and you can be pretty safe, but about 4 or 5 people each year decide to try to get a closer shot, and occasionally one falls off, and you have to be pretty careful when you're there. This is one of the more obscure things in Maine, this monument on the right, which is called the Tarratine marker. And throughout my explorations and adventures in Maine, you come across Forlorn, the unknown baby grave on the St. Croix River, or the unknown river driver's marker on the side of the perimeter road in Baxter State Park. And in 1888, the Canadian Pacific was pushing hard to get this railroad line that runs from west to east across Maine completed. And they were working on the tracks on the line between Rockwood and Jackman. And supposedly there was an enormous explosion. The dynamite went off, not dynamite, probably was black powder, went off early, and up to 13 crewmen were killed. Well, what's interesting was it didn't even make the papers back then, because these were Italian laborers, and much like other folks, minority groups and what have you, they weren't considered important enough to write about. So there were no newspaper accounts. And so the Tarratine Monument itself was later erected, which mentions son of Italy, and there may be some Masonic symbolism there as well. And it's about a mile down the tracks from where the road crosses now. and you can kind of walk down to it, and somebody goes every year and trims the bushes away from it, and it's still there, but the names of the people who died and exactly who they were is kind of lost to history, but that monument is still there. A little further east over in Greenville is the B-52 Memorial, and that commemorates in 1963 in January, a Strategic Air Command B-52 bomber was doing low-level mission training near Elephant Mountain in Greenville, and the stabilizer, the tall fin on the back of the airplane literally broke off, and the plane, it fell on the east side of the mountain. The plane crashed on the west side, and the crew had really no time to get out. Only the pilot and co-pilot who had ejection seats were able to eject, and 6 crew members died, and the co-pilot died when he struck a tree. So the pilot and navigator were the only 2 that were found alive, but the temperature at the time was -30, and there were up to 15-foot snowdrifts and no direct road to get to the site. So it took them until the end of the next day to actually find these men and evacuate the survivors. And the woods, all of the pieces of the B-52 are still strewn throughout the woods. Where that monument is today, that was part of the tail section, which actually had a tail gunner on it originally. And the Moosehead Riders Snowmobile Club maintains that monument, and the trail you can visit in winter, you can visit in summer, and other parts of the thing, including an engine and the ejection seat, are part of the Moosehead Historical Society in Greenville. I like this really interesting cemetery in Rockport, and it really shows the best and the worst of baby care. And it seems in April of 1940, authorities found a 5-month-old baby naked floating in a quarry in Rockport, right near Rockland. They couldn't determine the cause of death. They couldn't determine from birth records who he belonged to. They offered a $500 reward, which is equivalent to about $10,000 today, and never got any leads. But the story touched so many people in those communities that they buried him in the cemetery in Rockport and created this unknown, unwanted baby boy marker. And to this day, people frequently leave toys and coins and stuffed animals and other mementos at the gravesite. Well, it was just 4 years later that Dr. Benjamin Spock wrote his seminal work, Common Sense Baby and Child Care, which really was the anthem for people bringing up children in the 50s and 60s. And he went on to sell 50 million copies. Well, few people know that he actually lived in Camden, only about 4 miles from the cemetery and where this all took place. And he loved to go sailing. And when he died in 1988, he was buried on the other end of the cemetery from this baby grave. We talked a little bit before about places that were the capital of the world. And I think when it comes to Superiority Complex, Bryant Pond is kind of one of those places. And it was in the mid 1800s, long before indoor plumbing, they decided to build an outhouse on the back of the 3-story Masonic Lodge there on Main Street. And so it actually has a 3-story tall outhouse on the back of the building. And they didn't have plumbing installed in the building until the year 2000, and then only on the first floor. And even though lightning has hit the building before, the priviews remained unscathed. Well, next door, the Grange Hall, maybe they didn't have quite the energy that the Masonic guys did, but they have a 2-story outhouse on their Grange Hall. And just down the street is a former auto repair garage, which is now the private studio for Fox News personality Tucker Carlson. So when it comes to outhouses, though, Maine is no stranger to large outhouses. 4-holers with different openings for families were quite common. And reportedly, the world record for Maine anyway of outhouses was one with 8 holes, which was in a lumber camp up in the Allagash region years ago. Bryant Pond, you may remember and hear of, was the last place in the country to give up hand cranked telephones in 1983. And they had quite an effort not to go to regular dial phones. The old "don't yank the crank" was a popular slogan. And so that telephone monument was created as a commemoration for that. And a few hundred yards away from the telephone monument is the giant clothespin sign, which is believed to be the largest of its kind in the world, although that mill is long gone. This is a local rumor that I had to check out and go see for myself. And people always say if there was ever an apocalypse, a nuclear war, the only thing that would survive would be cockroaches and Twinkies. Well, the legend as far as Twinkies go may have something to it. In 1976, an unwrapped Twinkie was placed in a glass case at George Stevens Academy in Blue Hill, just to see how long it would go before it would spoil. And the company states the optimum shelf life is 25 days, but teacher Roger Benetti decided he would do this to talk about food additives and shelf life. Well, that Twinkie has now been on display for 44 years and has outlasted the company, Interstate Bakeries, that used to make Hostess cakes. It filed for bankruptcy and disappeared in 2021. That teacher long since retired, and Twinkie case now sits in the office of the assistant head of the school, who actually was a student in that class the day that they placed that under glass. Bouncing back up to the top of Maine again, in the village of Allagash is a museum that's entirely dedicated just to chainsaws. Chainsaws didn't start being used in Maine until around the 1920s. And in the St. John Valley, Louis Pelletier has collected more than 400 different chainsaws. He has ones that are for left-handed. He has all kinds of different lengths, every color, every size, every configuration. And Pelletier has created a museum on the grounds of his wood products company. And I guess greatness runs in the family because his sister is the writer Kathy Pelletier, who is famous for her novels and books about the St. John Valley area. You know, sometimes in Maine, characters get made up. I always tell people even some of the things in the book are real or perhaps imagined, and I leave it up to you to decide which are which. One of the great mythical characters of Maine was the mythical guide called Melunkus Harry, and this was a postcard that was published of him in the 1960s. It was used to attract sports to a fishing and sporting camp on remote Melunkus Lake, which is east of Medway, kind of up above Lincoln. And it was painted by a guy named Wesley Herrick, who was a proprietor of the lodge, and he was a great artist. He went on to create some other novelty character postcards that you see there. And there was even a book someone has written about the exploits of Melunkus Harry. And the fellow who wrote the book, he doesn't sell them. He says he'll trade them for you, and he prefers gunpowder bullets or permission to hunt on your land in exchange for getting one of those books. The Saco River in Maine has been long known for having a curse that supposedly was put on it in 1675 when several sailors from a European sailing vessel were involved in the death of a young Native American boy who they had heard that they could not sink, and so they had thrown him into the river, and of course he had drowned. And his father, Squandro, who was a chief in the area and who had kept the peace for nearly 50 years, cursed them and said that from then on there'd be no safety on the Saco River until 3 people had died each year. And over the years, there were drownings. Of course, it's a popular river, so lots of people do lots of things. And there's no record of the curse that people found in writing before 1880, but then lots afterwards. So it's probably just a rumor and a superstition. But in 1947, people said it was the first year that passed that there were no drownings on the Saco River. And the Maine Sunday Telegram actually ran a news story and said that the curse had finally been broken. So I guess if it was in the newspaper, that's got to be true. Of course, Charles Lindbergh being the first to fly solo across the Atlantic was a great feat, and he had some connections to Maine as well. And he went on a promotional tour with the Spirit of St. Louis's plane in 1927, and he was scheduled to stop in Scarborough for a talk in Portland, but it was fogged in, and he had nowhere he could settle down, and he circled for about an hour and a half, and finally he went, and without any fanfare or announcing it, he landed on Old Orchard Beach, which actually was designated on maps as the town's official runway. Well, people were quite excited, and they put the Spirit of St. Louis in a hangar owned by a famous aviator Harry Jones, who was Maine's first airmail pilot. And Lindbergh went on to give his talk. And there are other ties to the spirit of St. Louis in that in Canaan, Maine, the packing crate that was used to bring the plane back from France after Lindbergh's feat was actually turned into a Lindbergh museum with memorabilia up in Canaan. It's no longer open to the public. And then Lindbergh's wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, used to spend summers on North Haven Island in Penobscot Bay, and was no kind of stranger to Maine. Chester Greenwood, many people understand he is the inventor of the earmuff. Designing them in 1873, at age of 19, he supposedly, at the age of 15, he supposedly asked his grandmother to sew some tufts of beaver fur onto a wire hoop to keep his ears from freezing when he was out skating. Got his patent at the age of 19, and he continued to make earmuffs for 60 years. In 1936 alone, he made and shipped 400,000 pairs all over the world. He, like the Stanleys, was a mechanical genius, and he also created town's first telephone network and tinkered with heating system technology. And every December 21st since 1977, Farmington celebrates Chester Greenwood Day with a parade and lots of other festivities. When I was a kid, people would see you with earmuffs and just say, you must be so poor you couldn't afford a whole hat. But it was considered quite the invention at the time. Among Maine's others, sort of notorious rather than notable inventors, was Hiram Maxim, who was a native of Sangerville, which is up above Dover Foxcroft, and he was the one that created the machine gun, and he could fire 500 shots per minute, and this was back in 1884. He and Edward Vickers went on to produce them for England, and they were used in many of the British Empire's conflicts. And he ended up being knighted by Queen Victoria in 1900. And he continually revised his designs. And when he was in England, he would run ads in the newspaper warning neighbors when he was going to be doing his practice firings because so many people's windows were broken. He ended up going deaf before he passed away, which was undoubtedly from being exposed to all of those shots. Well, Sangerville, for a very small town, is also known for the fact that it actually has two of its residents that went on to become knights. And the other was Sir Harry Oakes. He was born in Sangerville in 1874, left Maine at 16 to seek his fortune and find gold. He went to Alaska. He was held prisoner by Russians. He finally struck it rich in Ontario and was knighted by King George IV. Some of you may know that Oakes also went on to own a mansion in Bar Harbor, which was the Atlantic Oaks Motel and later became the Atlantic Oceanside. He also was famous that he had an estate in the Bahamas, and he was bludgeoned to death there in 1943, and no one was ever charged with his killing. Lots of presidents have come to Maine. We're seeing a few of them in the last couple of weeks, but one of the more famous visits was when Dwight D. Eisenhower went to Rangeley. And I mean, Herbert Hoover's come to Maine, Roosevelt, of course, we mentioned earlier, President Taft, Obama, lots of different presidents have come here. So he went fishing up in the Rangeley area in 1955, and it wasn't a real wilderness solitude experience because he was followed by swarms of Secret Service agents, and more than 70 reporters. Well, he went with guide Don Cameron, and they fished the first day in some pools on the Galloway River, and he didn't get a single bite. Well, Cameron was feeling pretty bad about that, and so he went back to the camp that night and he called all his friends in Rangeley and said, I need you to catch every big fish you can and take them up to the falls on the Galloway, Little Boy Falls. And they put a low net just downstream to keep them from escaping. And they reportedly put several dozen multi-pound fish in that pool. And casually at breakfast the next morning, Cameron said to Ike, he said, I got a feeling your luck's going to change. Let's go down to the same place today. And Eisenhower went back to the pool and he cast out and he got himself a big trout, which made him quite happy, which made everybody happy. And in 1970, the Maine Federation of Republican Women have put a plaque on that spot talking about Eisenhower catching a big fish at that pool. That painting in the center was actually of Don Cameron, was done by Dwight D. Eisenhower who was quite an accomplished artist, and it now hangs in the Outdoor Heritage Museum in Aquasic, which has a lot of information about some of those kind of things. Talk about ghosts and mythical characters. I've kind of lumped them here together on one slide, but Maine is no stranger for that. You've got the Meadowbanks Howler and the Phippsburg Screecher and the Turner Beast and the Cherryfield Goatman, the Casco Bay's Cassie, which is reportedly related to the Loch Ness Monster. And of course, nowadays folks are sure that mountain lions are back in Maine. They thought that wolves never were, but they did confirm some passed through in the past. So there's lots of things going screech in the night in Maine, and you never know if it's one of the mythical beasts or not. And then finally, you've got the Cryptozoology Museum down in Portland, and Cryptozoology, which is the study of beasts that may or may not exist, and some of the creatures such as Sasquatch, Loch Ness Monster. The museum, which is considered to be the only one in the world, has a 9-foot statue of Bigfoot in there, supposed samples of Yeti hair, lake monster displays, skunk ape, Jersey Devil, and many others. And they also have some props and oddities from different movies. It was founded in 2003, and the best thing about it is it's right next to the Bissell Brothers Brewing Company, so you can go and have a couple of beers and then go and find out about mythological creatures in Maine. So anyway, that's about 2 or 3 dozen of the 300 items in the book, kind of from one end of Maine to next. It's wild, it's weird, it's wonderful, and thank you very much for having me speak today. I'll unshare the screen here.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. So if you have any questions before we wrap things up, please feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have. I had one question to sort of just get us started, or if nobody else has any questions, but I know you've written some other books. Can you tell us about your other books and what possibly you might be working on now?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've done several what are considered casual histories. One was called Forever Yours, Bar Harbor, and they're based on postcards. And I started collecting them when I used to sell them. Memorabilia and antiques and things like that, and I got thinking, wow, what's there now, and what does this image, what story does it have to tell about the past? And so I did Forever Years, Bar Harbor, Bygone Coastal Maine, Bygone Backwoods of New England, and then Bygone said the Coastal Maine. Then we did a book for Boston, Cape Cod, and the islands, and that's with Islandport. And then a book that's mostly dear to my heart is called Return to Moose River, and it's a book of essays about the North Woods, just sharing that special magic and that connection between people and the landscape. I think we've done a lot in Maine connecting and preserving woods and waters and mountains, but we need to preserve the human heritage too, because when you find that long lost grave out in the woods, that's part of the story, and the people in the land in Maine are interconnected. They're inseparable. So that little bit of bragging here, won the John Cole Award for Maine Theme Nonfiction last year, so I was pretty excited about that. And what I'm working on now is a book in 1944. There was a Navy airship that went down off Mount Desert Rock, and it was listed as pilot error, but how do you crash something that's lighter than air? And the thing is that they are up there investigating reports of a German submarine in the area. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it may have been shot down. And so that's something that it's the last inquest from World War II in the Navy that remains under seal. And so I think it's worth looking into. 3 months later, the Germans submarine dropped 2 spies ashore at Hancock to go steal the atom bomb secret. So I think there's more to that story. So I'm working on that project now.
Oh, that's really neat. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the book, we have it at the library. And I badly dog-eared this one because I wanted to mark it. I think you covered all my favorite ones because I specifically had marked the one for the Curse on the Saco. And then I've been up to Elephant Mountain, which I think is just amazing. If people haven't been up there, it's actually quite moving.
It is.
So we do have one question in our chat, and the question is, did you visit at each and every location? If so, what was your favorite overall, and what was your favorite lighthouse?
It's really, I have not visited every single one. There are a couple of weird ones that I just, time and distance. My wife and I when I would give a talk on the Moose River book up in Carrabassett, we'd stay in Kingfield and spend 3 or 4 days hitting all the spots over there and doing that kind of stuff. I think my favorite spot was that epic baseline down there in the Blueberry Barrens, way down east. That just has kind of an other world feel to it, and it's not far from where there was a peat bog where they had one of the world's largest machines that would vacuum up the peat, and then they were burning it in a power plant there in Deblois, and the machine was called the Martian Bigfoot, which was just kind of cool. And that's something I didn't get into this particular issue of the book, but I think that whole area down east is again, people drive through and they see big open areas and dirt roads and no houses and think nothing ever happened there, but there's a lot that went on there. As far as my favorite lighthouse, I really think I'm kind of partial, to this area. I really like Bear Island Lighthouse right off Mount Desert Island. Yeah.
We have another question.
Okay, I see in your travels throughout Maine, what has stuck out as your favorite tidbit that you've uncovered, or the strangest? That one I would have to say is definitely the Hannibal Hamlin death couch. I mean, how many people just save a couch because somebody famous died on it? I think that's one of the ones that really struck out. But I think one of the things that strikes me the most is that every place in Maine has these stories or these legends. And I think, faced often with folks from away or powerful forces, whether they're economic or educational, that people want to differentiate their communities. People want that source of local pride. And so I think some of these are cool. There's some ledges up in Phillips where the old narrow gauge railroad station used to be. And when people were waiting for trains, they'd go down along the river and chisel their initials into the ledges and along the stream. And it's just sort of that human yearning for immortality, I think, and for that to be remembered after they're gone. And I think that's all part of it as well.
Well, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. We really enjoyed the talk. And again, we have the book at the library, or you can pick up a copy. I honestly think that this would make a great Christmas gift for people. Because it's very, very readable. I love the way that the book is constructed. Like you said, there's this encyclopedic information at the beginning, and there's lots and lots of stories that weren't covered. The William Reich Museum up in Rangeley, the Wire Bridge.
My wife got a little creepy feeling after we went there.
Yeah, it's creepy.
Yeah, it's creepy. We're sitting there watching the first film, and they get into the whole sexual energy thing, and she gives me the elbow, like, what have you got me into here?
Yeah, it's a weird place, but it's this great location, but there's so many details in the book that you didn't get a chance to cover today. Yeah. So I really think that it's just a fabulous book and a great addition to Maine history and a lot of fun. And when your next book comes out, I hope that you'll join us for another talk.
Oh, I'd be happy to. The Reich Museum, I wondered when I went into his library why they had a piece of plexiglass covering all the books. And the reason is that they have an autographed copy of Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, and they're so worried somebody's going to steal it. So they covered the whole bookshelf with plexiglass to protect it. That's I probably should rephrase my earlier question. The Reich Museum definitely is one of those only in Maine kind of places. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just fascinating. But you've covered a lot, and I kept thinking, wow, I can't believe you got this in there. Wow, I can't believe you got. So it was really just a super fun read. So thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate it.
Okay, have a good night.
Great, and this will be recorded for everybody. If you have more questions, feel free to email, and we'll pass them on to Earl, and then hopefully get you answers.
Sure, happy to do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Earl.
All right, bye.
Have a great night.